Good evening. I'm Mike Connetter, and welcome to the UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community talking about timely and important topics. A year ago, we launched this series to take advantage of the unique situation that the COVID-19 pandemic presented. Since our first episode on March 31st, 2020, we've had the pleasure of hosting 42 episodes and have featured 65 UW faculty members and 22 UW alumni and industry experts. And best of all, we're approaching 100,000 unique views on this series. Virtually connecting so many alumni and friends to UW experts has been a silver lining in the pandemic for us. Joining us tonight are four experts from the UW community who will discuss the evolving landscape of COVID-19, vaccines, and public health. Tonight, we'll hear from Jim Conway, Professor of Pediatrics, Associate Director of the UW-Madison Global Health Institute, and Medical Director of the UW Health Immunization Program. Hannah Kirking is a medical epidemiologist in the CDC's Division of Viral Diseases and a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Public Health Service. Dave O'Connor is the UW Medical Foundation Professor of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, and Nasia Softar is Professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases, Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Medicine, and Medical Director of Infection Control at UW Hospital and Clinics. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. It's a very important topic and a very important moment as the U.S. continues to battle the pandemic. Our first speaker tonight is Hannah Kirking. She earned a bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering in 2004 and a medical degree in 2010 from UW-Madison. She's now a medical epidemiologist and a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Public Health Service. She leads the CDC-directed efforts to counter COVID-19 in Wisconsin. One of the first recipients of UW-Madison's Graduate Professional Certificate in Global Health, she responds to public health emergencies and disease outbreaks, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, including stints in Kenya, Myanmar, Liberia, and Mexico. During the Ebola outbreak of 2013 to 2016, she was embedded in rural counties in Liberia to help local teams cope with the disease. Hannah, I'm sure it has been an eventful year at the CDC, probably one you will never forget. And we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to share your perspective with our alumni and friends tonight. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you for the welcome. And it's great to be here tonight. I think I'll get started with a few slides. Thanks for putting those up. I guess just to start, I will say that my interest in global and public health all started at UW, so it feels a little bit like a homecoming to be part of the discussion. My goal for tonight is to share some data related to COVID-19 cases and vaccines, provide an overview of the process for vaccine recommendations at CDC, and also summarize a recent but notable publication related to vaccine efficacy, specifically on prevention of infection. And after that, I probably most of all look forward to the discussion across the other presenters as well as all participants in the audience. One last housekeeping detail I have to share is that I have to give my disclaimer before we start. So our discussion this evening and what I personally share are my opinions and don't necessarily represent the official position of CDC. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. This first slide is mostly to set the stage for tonight's overall discussion. This graph shows what epidemiologists generically call an epicurve. In short, it's a histogram that shows daily trends in COVID-19 cases reported to CDC. The x-axis shows the date and the y-axis shows the number of cases. Overall, as you can see, COVID-19 cases have decreased since the peak in January. The most recent 7-day moving average of new cases, or at least the most recent week on this graph, because there's about a one week reporting delay, decreased 77.2% compared to the highest peak, which was in January 11th. The most recent 7-day moving average shown here of new cases, again, relative to the peak that was back in July, decreased 15.4%. The caveat to all of this decrease that you can see on the right side of the graph is that on March 24th, there was a 6.7% increase in the 7-day moving average of daily cases. And although this graphic doesn't show the past few days, this uptick has continued. These increases are definitely getting attention of public health people around the country, as many of you have likely heard on the news. Next slide. I went ahead and added time points for each of the 3 FDA-approved vaccines here. As you can see, the Pfizer vaccine was recommended for use on December 13th. Moderna's vaccine was recommended for use on December 20th, and the Janssen vaccine was recommended for use on March 2nd. Next slide, please. So the last slide leads us to an important question. How does CDC make vaccine recommendations? Well, the answer to this is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or what we more commonly call ACIP. ACIP is a group of medical and public health experts that develop recommendations on how to use vaccines to control diseases in the United States. ACIP consists of 15 voting members who are selected via an application process at the HHS level. 14 of the voting members are experts in various public health or medical fields, including vaccinology, immunology, pediatrics, internal medicine, nursing, family practice, virology, public health, infectious disease, etc. There is one voting member who is a consumer representative, and their role is to provide perspectives on the social and community aspects of vaccination. In addition to the voting members, there are 30 non-voting representatives from professional organizations that are seen as highly regarded in the health field. Typically, these members comment on ACIP's recommendations, and they offer perspectives of groups that largely implement the recommendations. So examples of these professional organizations are the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Physicians, and you can imagine many others. The information that ACIP reviews for each vaccine always includes safety and efficacy of the vaccine at specific ages, severity of disease, the number of people who get the disease if there's no vaccine, how well a vaccine works for people of different ages, and how practical the recommendations are to put into practice. In summary, after ACIP develops their recommendations, CDC reviews them, approves them, and they're then published in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, or the MMWR. Lastly, ACIP usually meets 3 times a year, but during COVID, they've been convening much more frequently. Their meetings are open to the public and they're available via webcast. And the next one right now is scheduled for May 5th, in case it's of interest. Next slide, please. This map shows the number of doses of vaccines administered within the state or territory for every 100,000 people of the total population. It does not reflect the residency of the person receiving the vaccine, but instead where they received it. As you can see, our current situation is that the vaccine status varies a lot by state. States here shown in navy blue have administered and reported over 45,000 vaccine doses per 100,000 people. Those shown in the lightest color, or turquoise, have administered and reported 30 to 35,000 doses of vaccine per 100,000 population. Of note, these numbers include all vaccines that have been administered, regardless of the type of vaccine, site, or the partner who administered it. One thing that I'll point out here, all US vaccines were originally distributed to state health departments for distribution and use. The only federal agencies that received direct access to vaccines were the US Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Defense, Indian Health Services, and VA Health System. Later, there were federal pharmacy programs and other partners that started to receive vaccines through federal contracts. And the goal of that was to utilize existing distribution networks. Next slide, please. This slide has 3 graphics that show the breakdown of the national vaccine landscape as of yesterday. In short, the top graph shows the total number of people fully vaccinated in the US by vaccine series type. As you can see, over 26 million people are currently fully vaccinated with Pfizer. Over 23 million people are fully vaccinated with Moderna, and over 3 million people with Janssen's vaccine. The bottom two graphics look at the numbers in a slightly different way. The graphic on the lower left shows the total number of vaccines administered by vaccine type. The graphic on the right shows the total number of vaccines distributed by type. So essentially, left is administered, right is distributed. And in general, I think this slide shows some of the nuance and challenges related to collecting strong and accurate data as relates to vaccination efforts. Next slide. So this is my last slide, and it's hot off the press, as it was an early release yesterday. To quickly summarize why I'm sharing this, when the vaccines were granted emergency use authorization by FDA, the vaccine efficacy data that resulted in their approvals was specifically related to the vaccine's ability to reduce symptomatic or severe infection. The vaccine's ability to prevent infection was not necessarily part of their FDA approval. However, obviously we want these vaccines to not only prevent symptomatic or severe illness, but we also want them to prevent infection so that we can, lead to a quicker stop to the pandemic. So in short, this MMWR publication released yesterday described results from after following 4,000 healthcare personnel, first responders, and essential health workers who were tested weekly for COVID-19, independent of any symptoms. And in short, participants who were fully vaccinated were 90% less likely to get infected. So I won't go into all the details for time purposes for tonight, but this is obviously good news for vaccination efforts. Next slide. I think that wraps up what I was planning to share, and I'll pass it over to David O'Connor.
Hannah, thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks for your service, and look forward to asking a few questions when we come back.
Sounds great.
Our next speaker tonight is David O'Connor. David earned his PhD from UW-Madison in 2001 and is the UW Medical Foundation Professor of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. In collaboration with Tom Friedrich, O'Connor's laboratory leads an international network of investigators testing COVID-19 vaccines and medical countermeasures. O'Connor and Friedrich have been responsible for sequencing SARS-CoV-2 genomes from cases throughout Dane and Milwaukee counties to understand how these viruses are moving into and through Wisconsin. O'Connor also studies HIV/AIDS with the goal of developing a vaccine, and his work on the Zika virus explores when and how the virus leads to fetal abnormalities and what interventions could prevent or reverse those outcomes. David, thank you for joining us tonight, and I look forward to your perspectives as a researcher on vaccines.
Thanks, Mike, and I'll try to be fairly brief to make sure that we have plenty of time for question and answer. It's incredible to me that it's been about a year since I was standing in front of the same desk and Nasia called me a night in February and said, we might need some research lab help with some sequencing and potentially some testing, and whether we might be able to help, because it's been a nonstop scramble since then. And as Mike said, my lab with Tom Friedrich's lab and Shelby O'Connor's lab has been really involved, especially in the sequencing of viruses, that is, tracking the sequences of virus through time and space. And in 2020, this was largely a curiosity. But at the end of 2020, the emergence of these so-called variants of concern shone a bright light on the importance of doing this sort of work so that we can understand how the virus is changing and what that might mean for vaccines. Since the start of the pandemic, we've been doing this in Dane County at a level that is much higher than you see in most other places. So nationally, we're at something like 0.2 to 0.3% of viruses get sequenced. Here in Dane County, we've been at about 5% since the start of the pandemic. And that's a credit not only to the hardworking people in our labs, but also our colleagues and other stakeholders, testing labs, state and local public health, our friends at the CDC. This community response really allows us to keep a close eye on the viruses that are circulating in our community. It allowed us to identify the first B117 or UK variant virus in our community 6 days after the sample was collected, which was very, very fast and allowed us to mobilize a very quick response. Now, what do we do with this information? Well, right now, it's very clear that we're in a race between injections and vaccines, as Hannah was saying, and infections. And we've got to put every tool that we have at our disposal into play to give the vaccines the best chance to work. And the good news is that the vaccines still work against the B.1.1.7 variants, the ones that are still most common, the most common variants of concern here in the US and here locally. But we need to keep it that way. And that means that we need to intensify those public health measures that we know work. I personally would like to see no shirt, no shoes, no service replaced with no shirt, no shoes, no mask, no service, until we get our cases down to the same level as some of the other exemplar countries that are of similar size and complexity to ours, that also have large cities. But countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan have all done a much better job, orders of magnitude fewer cases per capita than we've had here in the US. And so we have an opportunity with these vaccines to act as a circuit breaker and give a chance to reassert control over the virus. But it's up to us whether or not we're going to take that chance. And so with that, I will stop and turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you, David. And we'll come back to you with questions later. I know people are going to want to hear the perspective of you and your lab on a number of issues. So we'll come back soon. Our next speaker is our most frequent speaker. Dr. Nasia Softar is a professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases, the Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Medicine, and the Medical Director of Infection Control at UW Hospital and Clinics. She leads the department in its mission to reduce and prevent healthcare-associated infections by identifying, testing, and implementing novel interventions. In 2017, she received a President's Early Career Award for scientists and engineers, the highest honor bestowed by the US government on scientists and engineers as they launch their independent careers. She received her MS and PhD from UW-Madison. Nasia, this is your fourth appearance on our show, and you kicked us off 1 year ago tomorrow. So thank you for joining us again, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives on how we're doing in our fight against this virus.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Mike, and it's an honor to be invited back. My focus really has been on preventing SARS-CoV-2 infections in the healthcare systems, both in patients and in healthcare workers. And one of the things that, as Dave alluded to, in the early days of the pandemic, the immediate conclusion that one would leap to if a healthcare worker had SARS-CoV-2 infection was that it must have been acquired in the healthcare system through caring for patients with suspected or known COVID-19. And in fact, what he found through his sequencing efforts and that of his group was that it was very unlikely for healthcare workers to acquire SARS-CoV-2 within their duties as a healthcare professional. They were much more likely to be exposed to it in the community, just like everyone else was. And so the sequencing efforts there really helped guide us as far as our PPE recommendations, as far as our infection control practices went. And now with vaccinations, they're very welcome, of course. It's the step that's going to change the trajectory of this pandemic. But it does lead us to then have to rethink about what happens to PPE, what happens to testing, and what happens to infection control recommendations now that the vast majority of the healthcare workforce has been vaccinated and an increasing number of patients are able to get the vaccine. So if we go to the next slide, it will show us this is the current PPE that we use. So on the left, you have the PPE that is used in our system for patients with suspected or confirmed COVID-19. And so it's a face shield, it's a respirator, it's gowns and gloves, all with hand hygiene. For those who are unable to wear N95 respirators, there's the purified particulate air purifier, which is a PAPR. And so these are necessary steps to take for healthcare workers to protect themselves and other patients from SARS-CoV-2. But you can see that this PPE is not very easy to do any kind of work in. It results in fatigue in healthcare workers. It's difficult to see through a face shield when you're trying to do a procedure. And so anytime we can simplify it while still adhering to all safety precautions, it's going to be important. So that's the subgroup of us that are taking care of patients with known or suspected infections. But on the right-hand side of this slide is all healthcare workers who are doing universal masking, and for many of us, universal face shield use, no matter what the diagnosis that the patient may have. And again, this is a step that is necessary, and we want to continue it for as long as is necessary. But it has led to a change in practice, because it's something even as seemingly simple as putting a peripheral IV line in, you can't really see very well through the face shield. And so people then develop workarounds and ways to be able to do their job effectively. So if you go to the next slide, there we can see the current state of PPE is that we are doing universal masking, and masks are still being reused. We hope to soon get to a point where we don't have to reuse a mask, but we are very far away from where we were in terms of mask use in the pre-pandemic days. In the pre-pandemic days, you would wear a surgical mask, which is a disposable mask, once for one patient encounter, and then you would discard it, which is how it's manufactured and how it's intended to be used. But with all the PPE shortages and the fact that universal masking was happening, their trade-offs had to be made between, do you wear a mask for longer than a single patient encounter, because you don't want to be continually donning and doffing PPE, because it increases the risk of contamination every time you touch your nose or your mouth. And so to protect the mask, then we wear face shields on top of it. So even if, there is an inadvertent splash or something, or someone coughing, that the mask is protected and the face shield can then be wiped off and reused. The same is true for respirators, the N95 fit-tested respirators for suspected and confirmed COVID-19. Many places are still having to reuse those because there are concerns about the robustness of the supply chain, even though it has improved since the early days of the pandemic. Now, all of that, of course, is the context for the fact that now a large proportion of healthcare workers have been immunized. Many of them are far more than 2 weeks after the second dose of the vaccine for the 2-dose vaccine, so they're considered fully vaccinated. And as Hannah mentioned, the vaccine real-world effectiveness is high. So are there opportunities then to change our work and our workflow? And the next slide. These are the recommendations from the CDC. Just a word of caution is that they're recommended for the public, not for healthcare settings. In healthcare settings, we haven't really changed any of our current practices, and at least for the immediate future, I don't think that we have plans to change those. But at least for the public, there is now this step that people can visit, in a very small, contained manner. Both parties should be fully vaccinated. When visits with unvaccinated people are permitted, as long as the unvaccinated individual is at low risk. And so essentially what that does is allow, as several of us have been able to, give a hug to your grandparents, for instance, that you haven't been able to see in person for over a year, assuming that they've been vaccinated. Now, all that to say that while these things are now allowable and permitted, but we still have to take all the kinds of precautions that we were taking before in terms of distancing, in terms of wearing masks in public settings. And if wearing a mask is the price that we have to pay for being able to get back to some sense of normal, I think it's a price that many of us would be willing to pay. If you go to the next slide, we can talk about what happens with testing. So our current status for many healthcare systems is that we are testing patients when they get admitted to the hospital, no matter what the reason for admission, with the idea that because many people don't have symptoms and may test positive for SARS-CoV-2, the sooner that we can identify them is the sooner we can place the appropriate precautions in place to prevent transmission within the healthcare system. The same is true for testing in pre-procedure, such as for colonoscopies or surgeries, and also for post-exposure. If someone has a known exposure to somebody with SARS-CoV-2, how do we test that individual to see whether they have contracted the infection or not? So at the moment, we're doing a lot of testing, and I think in the immediate future that is likely to continue. But it does, bring up an interesting question that when the patient is fully vaccinated and the healthcare workforce is fully vaccinated, do you still need to do pre-procedure testing? The reason why the question is more than academic is because any extra step that we put in the way of patients getting necessary procedures or surgeries puts barriers that are unwanted and often will result in a delay in patient care. So if it has to be done, which is in the early days of the pandemic and up until now needed to be done, then that's that. But we're always looking for opportunities to reduce barriers to necessary patient care. And so this is one other thing that we are exploring. Does everybody need to be tested, or is it certain subgroups depending upon the risk that the procedure or the surgery poses. I think if you go to the next slide. So what we're finding now, and I think learning from the other speakers as well, is that while the vaccines are terrific, of course, nothing is 100%. So we do expect that there will be some healthcare workers who will have symptomatic COVID-19 even after they've been completely vaccinated. And we are starting to see a few of those. The question that we ask ourselves, do they have a variant strain? And so a residual sample goes to the David O'Connor lab for them to be able to tell us whether this is a variant that could potentially have escaped the vaccine. The other possibility is that the healthcare worker did not generate immunity to the vaccine, either because they were immunocompromised or because of the immunosenescence of aging or for unrecognized reasons. And so being able to collect a blood sample at that point would be important, although it's also important to recognize that if you take too long in collecting a blood sample, you will not be able to distinguish vaccine-induced immunity from natural disease-induced immunity. So that's a little bit of a tricky question to answer. And the third thing that we worry about a little bit is that, we know that the vaccine is very efficacious against severe disease and hospitalization. And while there are some emerging studies that are also pointing to the fact that people typically do not have asymptomatic carriage after being vaccinated, we are testing that in our own healthcare worker population to be able to determine. But these are some of the reasons why going into the future, I think we have to be even more strict and careful about PPE and not really rush to a place where we can say, you don't need any of these things anymore, because as the virus evolves, I think so must our protocols. I think that was my last slide, and I'll hand it back over to you, Mike.
Yeah, we'll be back to you shortly with some questions. We'll go now to our final speaker this evening. James Conway is a professor of pediatrics and a specialist on infectious disease. He's the Associate Director of UW's Global Health Institute and the Medical Director of the UW Health Immunization Program. He's also a Fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, serving in the sections on infectious diseases and international child health. And he received an AAP Special Achievement Award in 2009 for his immunization projects. He's also a member of the Board of Directors of the Wisconsin AAP, where he serves as chair of the Committee on Immunizations and Infectious Diseases and represents that group on the Wisconsin Council on Immunization Practice. Welcome back, Jim. And I would love an update on how things are going in Wisconsin as it relates to immunizations and whatever else you want to talk about.
Thanks, Mike. It's really nice to be back with everybody. It's a lot of pressure batting cleanup here with the leadoff group here, but we're coming up on baseball season, so it's time. Jake, can you pull my slides up? So just a quick update on sort of where we are with vaccines. People have seen this graphic before from the New York Times, just to remind people that while we have 7 approved vaccines globally and 6 that are authorized, there are still almost 200 vaccines at various stages in the pipeline, including about 100 that are actually in clinical trials. And obviously, we're going to need vaccines to cover our entire 8 billion person population on this planet if we're going to completely eradicate this mess that we're in. On the right here, you can see basically what we consider the leading vaccines, those that have been approved at some level. And I always remind people that although Pfizer, Moderna, and the Janssen vaccine are really the ones that we think about most often here, there's a lot of other ones out there, including Novavax and AstraZeneca, that will likely be submitting for their emergency use authorization in the coming weeks or months. Next slide. Next slide. And just to give you some good news on sort of where we are in Wisconsin, to drill in a little bit further from what Hannah showed you. On the left, you can see basically where we are as a state by county, and you can see there's certainly areas that we have much better immunization uptake, as well as some areas that are still lagging. But here in Wisconsin, we have almost 30% of the population has received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. You can see that we've immunized over 75% of our population over the age of 65. We've been doing a very nice job in the American Indian and some of the other communities of color, although our Black population continues to lag behind, unfortunately. Next slide. And proudly, we can say that here in Wisconsin, other than Guam, we've actually been utilizing vaccine at a clip far better than the other 50 states. So if you look here, of the 180 million doses that have been delivered across the country, Wisconsin has delivered almost 3 million doses, and we've already used 95% of what we're given. And you can certainly imagine that as vaccine comes from the federal government and then arrives either in the state health department or in the various other administrative groups, that certainly in the beginning there was some struggle in turning this around, but people around the state have been extraordinarily creative in figuring out ways to get people scheduled and to make sure that we're using everything we're given. And so I think it's really exciting that in a state where only about 4.5 million people are over the age of 18, that we've really been delivering doses at a rate, as you can see on the bottom here, that essentially if you give it to us, we'll get it into people. And over 350,000 doses almost were delivered last week. So we are doing a really strong job here in Wisconsin of getting people immunized. And most of the rest of the country is gradually starting to pick up as they also get vaccine delivered. Next slide. I always have to put a global focus on this. And so these are the top 10 countries as far as doses per 100 residents. And you can see that Israel, as everybody's aware, was early in the Pfizer program and has immunized far more even than their general population. The UAE and Chile have also done a very good job. But you can see that scattered around the world, there are many countries that have actually done a reasonable job. Now, it's still quite slow in many areas, especially in Europe, Africa, and South America, at least in some countries. And so there is going to be some time, unfortunately, where disease will likely still circulate, and where not only the use of PPE and masking routinely, but also really travel restrictions are going to remain in place in each country, unfortunately, continuing to sort of make up their own rules as far as what vaccines or testing are needed as people start to pick up travel. Next slide. Just as we look at the U.S. population, this was just recalculated yesterday, and you can see that at the current pace that we're delivering vaccines, we had our peak day over the last week where we hit almost 3.5 million doses in one day. But on a good average day, we're delivering between 2 and 2.3 million doses a day. And so already we're looking at the pace that if people continue to be vaccinated at the pace that vaccine is flowing, that we actually would reach kind of this magical herd immunity of 90% immunization coverage by the middle of July. And I think that has really encouraged a lot of us, because as we started this off, it was a relatively slow pace, and many of us were worried that this was going to limp on until early 2022. And obviously with these variants emerging, that was something that we really were quite nervous about. But this increasing pace of vaccination and increasing acceptance has been really encouraging. Next slide. And so this just came out today from the Kaiser Foundation, and you're going to be hearing about this in the press today and tomorrow. But that we've really seen as more and more doses, and remember 180 million doses in a country of 330 million people, almost everybody knows many people now that have been vaccinated. And so if you go from the bottom to the top on this, you can see how eager people were in December, where a third of the country was really eager to get vaccinated, but about a third were kind of wait and see. And about 25% were going to only do it if it's required. And then as they periodically survey people month by month, you can see that the March survey just came out. And so that wait and see group has gradually shrunk. And I think very encouragingly, it has not shrunk in any way, shape, or form towards the reluctant side, but in fact has actually shrunk in the way that we would like it to, that as we have more vaccine delivered, there's much more confidence and much more clarity about these vaccines. And so we're really encouraged that the vast majority of the country has really adopted vaccine as the norm and are really eager to do this. And this has been especially encouraging in communities of color. And this data was very encouraging today, that we really are seeing a rapid uptake over the last couple of weeks in these communities of color, which are obviously the communities that have suffered the worst during this pandemic. Next slide. The issue, and one of the things that the group here wanted to touch on, was sort of how the side effect issues are going and kind of how people are viewing those. And so I threw this in for the group that are definitely refusing at this point. The top reason is still that they just don't feel like they've got enough information to make their decisions, and enough information about long-term issues. Some don't believe that it's effective against COVID, or they don't need it. But we're seeing that smaller and smaller groups are expressing their concern about the side effects and reactions. And I think that's very encouraging as we move forward. And then the last slide next. And so interestingly, and this one sort of took me by surprise, that as much as the media had, with Pfizer and then Moderna being sort of the first out of the gate, had sort of led people to the impression that those were the best ones and everything else was going to be sort of second rate. I think it's been interesting that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as a one-dose vaccine is actually the one that the people in the wait and see category actually have an affinity to. I think that we're starting to realize that some of these folks, either the inconvenience of trying to deal with 2 doses or people just not liking needles, may actually play into some of their reluctance. And so it turns out that by a slim margin, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is the preferred vaccine. And so one of the things you've seen here in the US recently has been a pivot from continuing to try to rapidly develop new vaccines and a pivot towards actually increasing the manufacturing of these vaccines. And so Pfizer and Moderna and now Janssen all have auxiliary manufacturing facilities that are being approved by the FDA in collaboration with other pharmaceutical companies, so that there's actually going to be a lot more vaccine available. And so that's the reason that we have the happy news of announcing that Wisconsin will actually be opening up all vaccines for all individuals over age 16 on Monday, April 5th. And so we are extraordinarily happy that not only have we been doing a great job of moving vaccine, but that the vaccine supply has gotten to the point where it can basically be open to everyone. And so as of Monday, everybody out there over age 16 is now eligible in the state of Wisconsin to be vaccinated. And so there's nothing that makes me happier than the idea of mass herd immunity as a way of really tamping this down and hopefully getting back to a much more normal baseball season and summer for all of us. So I'll turn it back to you, Mike, and we'll see what people have to talk about with questions.
Nothing like a cleanup hitter delivering breaking news. So thank you for that. And I personally am excited to hear that. I wish they still kind of went down the age groups a little bit, because I'm worried all the youngsters will get in front of me now, but I'll do my best. Well, what a great show. I know we're going to bring everybody back. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience already. And the first question is from James Rotenberg, and it's about the vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines specifically. Can anyone comment on the most significant differences between the vaccines, particularly on the dimensions of, do we know anything about how long they last? And do we know anything about their relative effectiveness in preventing a vaccinated person from transmitting the virus to an unvaccinated person?
Well, I can certainly tackle the first part about sort of distinguishing the vaccines. These are both mRNA vaccines. The Moderna vaccine has a little bit higher dose. It's 100 micrograms of mRNA as opposed to the Pfizer vaccine that's 30 micrograms. But other than that, they're pretty much identical from an immunologic standpoint as far as what they do. Now, there are some differences as far as one has reconstitution and they have different freezer temperatures and things like that. But from a practical standpoint, there's really very little difference. And I should probably throw in also that most of these other vaccines that are also coming down the pipeline are actually much more similar to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines than people realize. Most of these ones, even the adenovirus-based vaccines, contain a DNA snippet that gets inserted by that adenovirus that then becomes mRNA, and you go down that exact same pathway of that mRNA then becoming spike glycoprotein antigen that then stimulates the immune system. So I think people need to, in some ways, sort of back away from this idea of splitting hairs about these vaccines being very different. And in fact, I think we really need to consider them all pretty much the same at this point for the vaccines that are currently available. And then as far as how long the immunity is going to last, of all the things that we did with trying to speed up this process, the only thing we really sacrificed in the speeding up of this was that long-term follow-up. Not that it gives us anything on the safety side, but just gives us how long is this immunity going to last. And so that's the part that's still to be determined, is this going to be something like a flu shot where we need regular boosters? Now, the other piece of that is also what happens with the variants and whether we need to keep then updating the vaccines like we do with the flu vaccines every year. And so that also is to be determined. But I think we'll be figuring that out thanks to Dave and many of his colleagues as we figure out exactly what these variants look like and then what the immunogenicity of the vaccines is against each of the new ones.
Well, that is in fact the next question from Sandra Chu Damani. How effective are the vaccines against the variants? Dave, do you want to say anything about that further?
Sure. So the evidence is still being collected. It definitely looks like the vaccines have prevented severe disease and death against the variants in vaccine trials that took place in South Africa, where one of the variants.
Jim, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Can you not hear me?
I wonder if I'll go ahead and take a question.
Mike, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so in South Africa, they tested 2 of the vaccines at a time when the South African variant, otherwise known as B.1.351, was circulating.
Definitely the recommendation in the US is still to receive vaccines based on the epidemiology.
Sorry, I'll be brief. The vaccines generally seem to work against the variants. More work is needed.
Question from Yvette Tesler. After recovering from COVID, are you more likely to have severe reactions to the vaccine? And do you have any recommendation of which vaccine you might get if you are someone who's already recovered?
Well, we certainly know that after people have had COVID, similarly, if you've had a dose of a COVID vaccine, your second dose, you have a much more robust immune response, and you're going to have higher rates of side effects. And it's very similar than if you've had COVID disease and you get a vaccine, especially if you get it very shortly after you've recovered, that it's more likely that you're going to have a little bit more impressive reaction. And so that's one of the reasons that people are recommending that people will delay getting vaccinated. And early on, we were asking people to wait 90 days, partially because we know that there's good protection after a COVID infection, although it does wane, and partially just because we had such limited supplies. So I think that in general, after a recovery, 90 days is probably a safe period of time. If you had a very mild case, I think you would probably do it at 30 days and not have too much trouble. It doesn't really matter which vaccine it is, and I think people really shouldn't try to twist themselves into knots to try to find and get a particular vaccine. At this point, really, they all should be viewed pretty equally.
So I just want to say, Hannah, I think, is having some technical issues, as you could probably tell, and was having trouble hearing other people. So we'll try to get that fixed and get her back in here. But question for Dr. Softar. Do you think workplaces should consider mandating vaccines? Or what's your position on that? And how has UW Health handled that issue?
So at the moment, I'm not aware of any workplaces that are mandating the vaccine. And part of the reason is that these have been authorized by the FDA under this, new process that is being used. However, eventually, the expectation is that they will be fully approved. And at that point, I think we will have gathered enough long-term data. We will have gathered enough side effect profiles beyond what we have now. And so ultimately, I think it would be a good plan to mandate this vaccine. And given how effective, all of them are and the major impact that it can have on infections and healthcare workers, I think it makes complete sense. But whether that will happen yet this year, I don't think we know that quite yet.
But you think that's a possibility down the road?
Yes, absolutely.
And the idea of vaccine passports for different things would be something we might consider.
Yes.
Thank you. One question I have to ask, early on, Vladimir Putin talked about a vaccine the Russians had developed. There are a number of vaccines the Chinese have developed. We haven't talked about many of those other vaccines, but how are those countries doing with the administration of their vaccines? And are their vaccines essentially similar to Pfizer, Moderna, J&J? Is everyone kind of working with the same toolkit here?
No, most of the vaccines that those countries started developing early were really based on sort of older technology, the same type of technology we use for flu vaccines and things like that. So they're using, just inactivated parts of the virus. And because of that, they do seem to have a little bit less efficacy, at least in preventing mild symptomatic disease. They certainly, at this point, the Sinovac vaccine from China, which is being primarily used in Brazil, does seem to actually be fairly effective at preventing the serious complications of hospitalization and death. But a lot of them really, sort of time will tell how long their immunity holds up. So they were, sort of started out as using old technology as opposed to the Western North American and European technology that's, a little bit more advanced. The one thing that's been really interesting, Mike, is this vaccine diplomacy that's been happening. China has been actually sending out more vaccine to surrounding countries than they've been using within their own country. And they just issued a ruling about a week ago that actually says that they're going to start accepting travelers, but only if they've received a Chinese vaccine. So you can sort of see where they're going, and that they're basically trying to rebuild their ties in the surrounding theater by essentially sending out vaccine. And in fact, there's been more Chinese vaccine administered outside of China than inside China. And Russia's been doing some similar things lately. So there really is sort of a diplomatic side of this as well. And so that's part of the reason that the US and other countries are trying to reinvigorate this COVAX idea that WHO designed, which was basically to try to get vaccine available at cost or at very low cost to less resource countries. And so, countries that are sitting on large orders of vaccines, the US, Canada, Japan, the UK, are really under some increasing pressure to start sharing a little bit with more of our neighbors. And I do hope that there's actually more movement, because again, we're not going to get rid of this thing unless we actually immunize across the globe. Just immunizing in the United States really only gets us safety moving from Illinois to Indiana and Wisconsin, but a lot of us want to go to a lot more interesting places than those.
Well, thank you. Now that we've brought up the WHO, they recently released a report on the origins of the novel coronavirus. How certain will we ever be about where the virus originated? And does the medical research community feel satisfied that the team from WHO got timely and thorough access to the information that would be of value in reaching conclusions on this issue? And maybe I could start with David on this.
Sure. So without a smoking gun, everything is just speculation with varying levels of confidence. And the most confident explanation, because we've seen this time and time again, whether it was Ebola in West Africa, whether it was, the emergence of Zika in Uganda back in the 1940s, and many times since then, is that viruses jump species barriers from animals and infect people. And whether that happened in Wuhan, whether a wet market was involved, I personally favor an explanation more similar to HIV, because I'm an HIV virologist at my core, which is that in HIV, the original infections were thought to take place in Cameroon. Traders made it to Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa in the DRC. And from there, the big city acted as an amplifier. I happen to think that that's a very plausible explanation here as well. It just so happens that the big city in which that amplification happened, Wuhan, also does have a high containment laboratory that studies coronaviruses. Well, why do they study coronaviruses? Because coronaviruses were a leading candidate to be a type of virus that would jump from bats or other animals into humans and cause an epidemic. That's why they studied them. That's why they had a high containment lab. I think, there certainly will need to be further investigation, but there's no evidence that the virus was in any way engineered. There was no evidence that the virus leaked in terms of infected or sick lab workers that have been made known to the investigators who were there as part of that WHO joint mission. China's record on transparency is not good. We all know this. So it's possible that we wouldn't get that information even if it did exist. But I think when we look, we need to think about the most parsimonious explanation for something that is similar to but distinct from viruses that have been known to infect people in the past, including the original SARS Classic from 2003, which came through civet cats. Why civet cats? Who knows, right? It isn't the first place you would have looked for an intermediate host for a virus like this, but yet that's what happened. And so I think that absent compelling evidence to the contrary, the animal zoonosis still remains the most likely explanation.
I do not spend enough time with people who study viruses. Let me just say that. A tour through the animal kingdom. Jen Rosinski wonders what percentage of the population needs to be vaccinated to prohibit the COVID spread. The number seems to change, and maybe it changes because it's not just vaccination, but cases, people who've already had it. But Hannah, do you have thoughts about where we need to get to in terms of reaching the so-called herd immunity thresholds?
Yeah, I do have thoughts, and definitely curious to hear what some of my colleagues' thoughts are as well. I think the idea of herd immunity is a theoretical one, and it's a real one that we do strive for. I think trying to hit a certain target, and sometimes we throw out a number and sometimes we don't. I think knowing exactly what that target is right now is still, I don't think we know. And I guess there's several things that I'll just share that relate to this, because it might also depend on the population. Individual vaccines are going to vary a little bit. And so what vaccines are used across a population will partly affect what that number might be. Background infection rates and what that curve has looked like up until now, and the timeline with which the majority of your population who were infected when that happened and who they were, also will kind of affect, what that number might be. Right now, there's some data that adults versus kids may or may not transmit differentially. And so, the makeup of adults versus kids in a population may also be related to what that herd immunity threshold could be. And so I really think that question is, we don't yet know what it is. Definitely higher is going to be better, which is why still the best answer for it is hitting our target groups with vaccines, especially as more are coming down the pipeline. And I apologize. I know that's a little bit of a hedge, but that's like the epi pieces that all go into that.
So we're now at about 15% of the U.S. population that's fully vaccinated, I think, based on the numbers I heard earlier tonight, give or take. And what percentage of people do we think have actually already been exposed to COVID-19? Of course, that's larger than the number that have tested positive, but any guess on that?
There are guesses. I mean, it's a little bit of a complicated question because it relates to every step of, a certain proportion of people are asymptomatic versus symptomatic. There's a differential number of people who actually then get tested, those who actually get reported, etc. I will say what we have done at CDC is we take all of those different steps into account and we make estimates for overall burden of infection. And it's published on our website that kind of shows what that is, and it's broken down into different age groups. And so essentially it's a little bit of modeling, but it is based on real data at each of those steps. So it's out there, and I can try to share the link to it in the chat box because different audience members might want different pieces of it. I'll try to paste it in there.
Yeah, that would be great. We do have a lot of geeks in the audience, and I count myself among them. I've been to the CDC museum, Anna. How about that?
It's a geeky museum, but it's kind of nice, isn't it?
Well, if you ever doubted the value of science, you should visit the CDC museum because it's really quite stunning to see the things that we've achieved with science. So,
hey, Mike, can I jump in on this for a sec?
Absolutely, Dave.
So I feel quite strongly about this, that the notion of herd immunity and the notion that there's a magic number is a false narrative, and it's going to lead to some misinformation months down the line if we don't counteract it right now and start really messaging around the point that we don't know. And Jim mentioned this earlier, we don't know how durable the immunity is going to be. And by the time we're up to 60, 70, 80% of people vaccinated, and the first people who have been vaccinated for 6 months or longer, if this vaccine does not provide immunity that is measured in many years and instead is more like the flu vaccine, where it is being consistently reformulated to anticipate and keep up with the variants, this number of times you're going to need to be vaccinated might be more than just once. We don't know right now. The amount of immunity that you're going to lose over 6 months, 12 months, 18 months might be quite significant. We don't know that right now. And so you might have a situation where 90% of the population have been vaccinated, but the immunity that's conferred by that 90% of vaccination is not as strong as you might otherwise expect. And so we need to, again, think about these vaccines as being circuit breakers that can control the virus we have right now. That's why I feel so strongly about trying to drive transmission as low as we possibly can, because we don't know what's going to come next. We don't know what it's going to look like. But just as we don't typically talk about herd immunity from a flu vaccine, I don't think that concept necessarily engrafts onto COVID based on what we know right now. If it's a happy coincidence and it does, great, but we shouldn't be banking on that being the case.
Great commentary and a cautionary note for sure, and underscores the point you made earlier that this is a global problem, and if it's not addressed everywhere, who knows how this evolves and comes back to us.
Mike, one quick thing, going back to your question of overall burden, 84 million in the US as of December is the estimate of infections. But again, to go back to Dave's point, that immunity for some of those 84 million may or may not be waning right now.
Question from Jaya Viramani. Are side effects like pain, fever, etc. of vaccine, are they a sign that the immune system is kicking into gear? If so, not experience anything, would that mean the opposite and that the vaccine doesn't work for you?
It's an interesting question. I think that we certainly know that, as you get sequential vaccines in the 2-dose, that the second one is certainly more of a kick than the first one. And so, the evidence is that is based on the immunologic response. But we also know that there's plenty of people that sail through and actually have no side effects and seem to also have very robust immunity. So I think it's really much more everybody's different and everybody's individualized. I mean, when you think about the people that are having more side effects, they do seem to be in smaller people, in younger individuals, and in women are the ones that seem to have a little bit more in the way of side effects. And, it certainly makes sense that if you're giving the same dose of vaccine to a 300-pound guy or a 120-pound woman, that's just, the same amount of antigen in those two people. There's just a lot more volume of distribution in the big guy. But there's probably a lot more nuance and a lot more immunopathology that actually needs to be sorted out. So people that don't get much in the way of side effects shouldn't be disappointed that they're missing out on some of the experience. So far as we can tell, they also still get very robust immunity and good protection.
Nasia, I want to ask you, has there been a relatively stable relationship in what you've observed between the level of infections reported, positive tests, and then hospitalizations, say, with a 3-week lag or whatever the appropriate lag is? Or are we finding that that's changing a bit, and are we having less hospitalizations now relative to the number of cases, or has that remained constant?
I think in the beginning, it was a very predictable event that you would have a surge in cases in the community, and with a lag of a few weeks, you would get a surge of hospitalizations. I think in the last few weeks, what we've noticed is we get little ebbs and flows, but the overall number of patients in the health system with COVID-19 is pretty manageable and is far less than what we experienced back in the fall, even as the infections continue to swirl in the community. So some of that is almost certainly a vaccine effect, because the group of people that were getting hospitalized were generally on the older edge of the age spectrum with comorbid illnesses and so on. So I think that race against the between the infections and the injections is a really crucial one. And if in the end we come to a place where SARS-CoV-2 continues to circulate, but it doesn't result in people getting very sick, it doesn't result in the need for medical care, that may be the next phase of what this will look like. But so far, I think we're optimistic that hospitalizations at least are manageable.
Thank you. Question from David Doyle relates to something we discussed earlier. Given the nature of this expedited process, we don't know how effective these vaccines will be for long-term immunity, but how long will it take us to know that? As long as it takes us? I mean, do we need long-term data to answer that question, or are there some leading indicators that would help us?
I mean, it's a complicated piece, and I think that everybody needs to sort of follow along. There's lots of vaccines that we've introduced, and then over time, watching disease surveillance and the durability of protection, that we add in booster doses. Varicella vaccine, we added in secondary doses as people reach teenage years to make sure we boosted them and gave them sufficient immunity. And when the tetanus shots came out, nobody knew that they needed to be given every 5 to 10 years. That's just the nature of science, is we do the best we can with the data we have, and then we continue to follow. I think people need to recognize that in the development of any pharmaceutical product, you go through phase 1, 2, and 3 that we always talk about. Phase 4 is in many ways the most important, which is the post-licensure monitoring of all of these people, not only for long-term safety things, but also for long-term efficacy. And when you start to see fading of immunity in various ways, then that's when we start to the discussions of actually offering boosters and additional doses or modifying the vaccines. So as Dave said, the time will tell. We've got him and many of his colleagues tracking these variants, and those are going to be basically what we follow, along with how long people remain non-infected, to determine what we're going to do in long term with booster doses.
I'll just jump in there as well,
yes.
if I can. The other thing that will impact the need for booster might be what the overall pandemic does and what transmission's doing. You know, if transmission greatly comes down, it might be that there's a benefit of a booster, but if we don't need to do it, then we don't need to do it. So that's the other thing that I think will play an important part in that. And part of the reason why I think there is an urgency to knock down the total number of transmission events. It's not only about variants developing, but it also makes the rest of this simpler, cheaper, more efficient, and hopefully with better outcomes for everyone.
So it sounds like I shouldn't be quite as excited as I was this week, feeling like we were getting somewhere. I did see the CDC director on TV yesterday. I didn't have audio, but I think the air quotes said impending doom, a sense of impending doom. So I guess I'll take ample precautions going forward. I have a question about the COVID long haulers. Are they seeing improvement in symptoms after getting vaccinated? Is there any evidence on that, or is that just anecdotal? And if there is evidence, do we have a reason kind of why that would be the case? Okay, we go to the next question.
It's a staring contest. No, I think you hit it. You actually answered it. I mean, it's so far, being reported in the media, and it seems to be anecdotal at this point. There's certainly some biological plausibility that it could, potentially get somebody over the finish line in their immune response and finish clearing something. But time is going to have to tell on that one as well.
Okay. Question from Kirk Boehm. And by the way, we don't have to go to commercial breaks on our show, so we just keep going a little bit. If you have to leave, you can leave. It's okay. But Kirk wonders, should we assume that we will see more such pandemics? I mean, we've heard this. I'm not, personally, I'm not sure exactly why the frequency of pandemics would go up, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump in. So yeah, I mean, it's the short answer. We are doing a lot of things to our built environment. We're building into places where they used to be wildlife habitats. We've made it dead simple to get from rural places into urban areas that can be amplifiers for disease. We've made it so that when this pandemic first was making news in Wuhan and outside of in other parts of Southeast Asia, I was in Cape Town, South Africa, and I was back in Madison less than 48 hours later. Those conditions make it a lot easier for viruses that are getting a slow start somewhere to really take off and cause big outbreaks before the response can catch up. And that's going to keep happening. Every day there's low-level chatter of viruses that are unexpected in animals, viruses that are infecting small numbers of people, not only totally new viruses like this one, but viruses that are reemergent, that are usually really, really quiet, that suddenly increase in volume. And that's just going to keep happening. So we really need to come out of this not only with a better understanding of this virus, which fortunately does have a fairly low fatality rate, and as viruses go, was an easy virus to develop vaccines against. It has a stable target for vaccines, and all the vaccines pretty much target the virus in more or less the same way. It's not always going to be that easy. We've been studying HIV for more than 40 years and don't have a vaccine. So we both have to intensify our preparedness and not expect that the confidence that we had in developing a vaccine with unprecedented speed is going to hold next time as well, because it might well not.
The other thing to remember is most people on this call have actually been through pandemics before, that we've just gotten, in many ways, lucky. 2009 H1N1 was a pandemic that fortunately we already had the capacity and ability to respond quickly with vaccine. I was in medical school during the beginning of the HIV pandemic, but pandemics happen. And, all of these, as Dave mentioned, generally emerge from animals and viruses in animals that leap into other species in between, and then into humans. And this is going to be something that we need to be aware of and need to do more surveillance. And we need a much more integrated surveillance system globally with much more communication and collaboration, because this whole thing is really in many ways preventable and avoidable with better surveillance and better integration of lab networks. But there has to be a real effort to do that.
And Dave, I just want to follow up on that. I mean, this is not a case that we're just better at measuring the incidence of things than we used to be, and thus the frequency looks greater. Could you address that?
Well, certainly the ability to have some element of public surveillance for these sorts of diseases in different places does contribute to a better awareness of them, which is good. But in my personal view, SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 became a pandemic of the magnitude that it did because of what was grotesque negligence on behalf of countries around the world, including ours. And I say that based on the fact that China, despite being caught unaware, unless there is a massive cover-up that's being hidden, has been able to keep the virus at bay, as have most countries in Southeast Asia, as have New Zealand and Australia. And so the fact that it's spread, and then exactly as Hannah said, the more transmission you have, the more opportunities you give the virus to adapt, to become more pathogenic, to find new niches. This was an unforced error, in my opinion.
Hannah,
last thing I'll just mention to that is I think it used to be too that we could worry about the pathogens within our borders, and just to re-echo that we can focus on the US and be very much US focused, but global health security is a real phenomenon, and we've seen it in SARS-CoV-2, and we'll talk about it increasingly. I think even if we can control the pandemic here, it'll still be everywhere else. So that whole idea of transmission elsewhere affecting our own, security here is incredibly real right now.
Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. You've all stayed past the top of the hour, but I would love, Hannah had to drop off for a bit due to our tech issues, and I just thought I'd let her wrap up our show with her thoughts on what everyone should be doing in the next several months as vaccines continue to be administered. And apparently it's not what I was thinking, which is get excited to go out and live life like I used to.
It might just be that we're at different paces of getting excited, Mike, because, I will say I spent some of last week with family members, and I realized I was following the rules. My time I spent with them was everyone was vaccinated, and those who were unvaccinated were not high-risk individuals, and it was myself and one household. So we might just have to slow the pace collectively for which we get excited for reopening. So I think in general, the big priorities, at least here in the US, is get vaccinated if you can. I think Jim's announcement that Wisconsin is opening up much more broadly is incredibly exciting. And frankly speaking, the performance thus far in the state is also really quite strong. So get the vaccines, continue to kind of follow the other recommendations, which includes masking up, keeping your social distance from other people you don't know. For those vaccinated, start to have your small group gatherings, but pay attention to the nuances, because the recommendations are definitely driven by the data right now that we have. The other thing I guess I'll just say that, CDC is always talking about how we scale back what we call the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So all the things that have disrupted all of our lives the last year plus, those get scaled back as that number of vaccines tick up. So both of those, it'll get better for everyone if we all get vaccinated and knock down transmission. Last thing I'll say too, that just maybe to sum it up for this audience, and maybe some of you have heard me say this, is I never understood the Wisconsin idea until I lived in 2 different states later. And right now, during this pandemic, have reflected back on working in the state again. So that is real, and that is something that is very special to the state and the university. So I'll also put that in there as my little, what I've learned in the last few years from being away.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for being here and taking time out of your schedules. This was a great segment tonight. I know our audience really appreciates your participation and insight, very different than what we can get almost anywhere else. So this is a wonderful segment, and thanks for all the wisdom that was shared this evening. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, and I want to thank many of you who've been with us for a long time on this program. And I have great news for you. Next Tuesday, April 6th, we're going to celebrate the Day of the Badger, which is our day of annual giving at UW, by having one of the greatest Badgers of them all on our show, Barry Alvarez, our beloved athletic director. So join us next Tuesday. Barry Alvarez talking retrospectively about UW athletics and his role in UW athletics, and prospectively about what we can look for going forward. Thanks for being here. Have a great evening, and on Wisconsin.
Lights. Curtain.
The job of the university is to serve, to prepare young people for the future.
Students learn that they are responsible for the welfare of their university. The good life doesn't just happen by itself. Somebody works at it. But it's fun when you do it together. Students from small Wisconsin towns with students from all over the world, brought together to share the interests, the loyalties of a single university family.